A police canine froze at an old shed and refused to move an inch. Officers thought it was nothing until they pried the floor open. What they uncovered inside left every single person speechless. Here's the full story. But before we continue, drop your dog's age in the comments. Make sure you've hit subscribe. The late afternoon sun stretched its fading warmth across the quiet edge of town, painting the horizon in muted tones of amber and gray. It was the kind of evening where shadows grew longer than the buildings that cast them, where every crack in the earth and every creak of wood seemed to whisper something left unsaid. For Officer Daniel Reed, evenings like this were familiar, almost comforting. But what he would encounter that day alongside his trusted canine ranger would shift from routine into something no one on the force could have anticipated. The call had come in casually, almost as an afterthought. A neighbor reported seeing movement around an abandoned property on the outskirts of town. The place was known locally as Miller's Shed, an old weather-beaten structure that had been left to rot after the last owner passed away years earlier. Most avoided it. The roof sagged inward, the windows were broken, and vines had clawed their way up the rotting wood like fingers refusing to let go. To anyone driving by, it was simply another forgotten shed, the kind of place kids dared each other to go near on Halloween. Yet when Reed pulled up with Ranger, the dog's demeanor shifted instantly. The canine, usually calm even in the face of chaos, froze as soon as the vehicle stopped. His ears pricked forward, his muscles stiffened, and his sharp gaze locked on the shed. He would not look away. At first, Reed assumed it was instinct. Dogs caught scents of raccoons, stray cats, or even rodents often in abandoned places. But when he opened the back door, Ranger leapt out with an urgency that felt different. His nose pressed into the dirt, tracing invisible lines that led straight to the shed's leaning door. Then, just as suddenly, he stopped. He sat down, his body rigid, his gaze never shifting. Reed gave the command to move forward, but Ranger would not budge. Instead, the dog let out a low, deliberate growl, his chest vibrating with a sound that was neither panic nor aggressive, but filled with warning. It was a refusal, pure and unshakable. Reed's partner, Officer Karen Holt, who had arrived in a second vehicle, walked up with a skeptical look. "Probably just a raccoon's nest," she muttered, but even she stopped short when Ranger barked, a sharp, commanding bark that broke the stillness around them. Something about it was different. It wasn't the bark of a dog chasing prey. It was the bark of a dog alerting, warning, demanding attention. The shed stood there, silent and unyielding. Its boards groaned in the wind, and a loose sheet of tin flapped weakly near the roof. To the officers, it looked like nothing more than a derelict storage unit, but Ranger refused to move. He kept his body rooted to the ground, eyes locked, as if the truth itself was buried beneath those rotting planks. The minutes stretched. The officers exchanged looks, and curiosity crept into the edges of doubt. What was Ranger sensing? Inside the shed, decades of abandonment had left behind the smell of mildew, damp wood, and forgotten things. Though no one could see it yet, the air itself carried something unusual, something layered with stories never told, something that pulled at the instincts of an animal sharper than any human tool. For Reed, Ranger's refusal meant one thing: this was no false alarm. He'd been trained to trust the dog without hesitation, and every fiber of his being told him that whatever was inside this shed was not ordinary. But questions formed in his mind like storm clouds. Why had Ranger frozen instead of rushing in? What could possibly make a disciplined canine refuse to move? Was it danger, or something else entirely? The officers took a cautious step closer, boots crunching on gravel. Ranger followed but stopped short of the threshold again, planting himself firmly. He scratched once at the dirt, barked, then sat down as if declaring the line no one should cross. Karen tilted her head, unsettled. "He's never acted like this before, has he?" Reed shook his head. "Never. He's trying to tell us something." The weight of those words sank between them. By the time backup arrived, the atmosphere had changed. The shed no longer looked harmless. It loomed with an intensity that made every officer on scene feel the heaviness of its silence. The perimeter was secured, flashlights flickered through the dim light, and yet Ranger's focus never broke. He barked again, shorter this time, sharper as though demanding urgency. The team prepared to breach. Each movement was deliberate, cautious, threaded with questions none of them could answer. But then came the moment that none expected. Just as they approached, Ranger lunged forward, not into the shed, but against its door. His paws scraped at the wood, his nose pressed hard, and his teeth caught the edge. Then he backed away, sat down again, and whined low in his throat. It wasn't aggression, it was something else, an urgency thick with meaning, as though he understood more than he could express. The officers exchanged glances, unease building like a tide rising against the shore. What could compel a K-9, trained to enter burning buildings, chase armed suspects, and sniff out explosives, to stop at the threshold of a forgotten shed? Was it danger buried inside? Or was it something that had been waiting, long hidden, for this exact moment? As night began to fall, spotlights were set up, and the shed's frame glowed under artificial light. The door, weathered and swollen with age, was pried open slowly. Each creak echoed like a scream in the still air. Dust particles swirled through the beams of flashlights as the inside was revealed inch by inch. The first sight was mundane, rotting shelves, broken tools, rusted cans. But something hung in the air, thick and heavy, pressing down on everyone who stepped closer. Ranger barked once more, sharp and commanding, but again did not move forward. The officers peered in, but the light seemed swallowed whole by the darkness inside. Every corner felt deeper than it should. Every shadow seemed to breathe. Karen muttered under her breath, "Something's off," and she was right. Reed stepped back, his instincts echoing Ranger's. He scanned the shed again, but this time not as a structure. He studied it as if it were hiding secrets in plain sight. His gaze landed on the floorboards. They were uneven, dirt-stained, some slightly raised at the edges, and then it clicked. Ranger wasn't refusing the shed itself. He was refusing what was beneath it. The realization tightened Reed's chest. Could there be something buried under those boards? Something hidden? Something concealed with care? The thought alone pulled every officer closer, yet no one crossed the threshold. They waited, breaths heavy, watching the dog. Ranger barked once more and scratched at the earth with a force that sent dirt scattering. His body trembled with urgency, and then silence. He stopped, sat. His gaze hardened, locked onto Reed as though saying, "You need to see. You need to understand." The connection between handler and dog was unshakable, born of years in the field together. Reed felt the weight of Ranger's unspoken message. Whatever was hidden here was not just chance. It was something meant to be found. The officers began to plan carefully. Entry, excavation, safety measures. But every step was slow, deliberate. The darkness inside seemed to resist their intrusion, as if the shed itself knew what was buried in its belly. And as the last sliver of sunlight vanished behind the horizon, one truth settled into everyone's bones. This was no ordinary discovery waiting to be uncovered. It was something that had been hidden deliberately, something tied to choices made long before any of them arrived. And Ranger, refusing to move, was making sure it was never left buried again. The shed creaked in the wind, the silence pressing harder, thicker, almost suffocating. Questions filled the air like smoke. What was buried beneath those boards? Why did Ranger refuse to step inside? And most importantly, who had left it there in the first place? The answers would come soon enough, but not tonight. For now, the mystery sat beneath their feet, waiting. And as Ranger sat firmly, eyes unyielding, the officers realized this moment was only the beginning of something larger, something deeper than any of them had expected when they answered a simple call about an abandoned shed. The dots were starting to connect, but the full picture was still buried. The night thickened around the shed as the officers formed a cautious circle, their spotlights casting fractured beams across its splintered walls. What had started as a routine call now felt like a living puzzle, each piece sharpened by the stillness of the dog who refused to move. Ranger's body language was undeniable. His paws stayed planted firmly in the dirt, ears pinned forward, tail stiff with tension. His refusal was not fear, it was insistence. His gaze burned through the darkness like a warning beacon. He knew something was there. The officers prepared their tools. Crowbars, shovels, gloves. The floorboards inside the shed groaned under their first steps. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of wood, the scrape of metal, even the measured breaths of men and women who felt as though the air itself was holding secrets. Reed stayed close to Ranger, watching him carefully. Each time an officer approached the center of the shed, Ranger barked once, short, sharp, like punctuation. It was a language Reed understood well. Ranger was confirming they were on the right track. The first board was pried up with effort. A rush of damp, earthy air escaped, carrying the smell of rot and old soil. Dust spiraled upward, catching the glare of flashlights. The officers exchanged glances but pressed forward. Another board came loose, then another. Beneath the warped wood was compacted dirt, darker than the earth outside, as if it had been disturbed once before. Karen knelt down, running her gloved hand over the soil. "It's been dug up before," she muttered. "Not recently, but not decades ago either." Ranger barked again, claws scraping the ground in frantic bursts. His entire body leaned toward that patch of earth. His growls rumbled low, demanding the officers dig faster. Shovels bit into the soil, each strike echoing like thunder in the still night. The ground was heavy, packed with clay, but as the officers broke deeper, the texture changed. The soil loosened, revealing layers that did not belong, fragments of cloth, splintered wood, small scraps that crumbled under touch. A rhythm began to emerge. Dig, scrape, pause. Every pause carried weight, as though each layer of dirt brought them closer to an answer none of them could name. Reed's thoughts wandered in restless fragments. Why here, in this forgotten shed? Why had someone hidden something beneath the floorboards instead of burning or discarding it? The very act of concealment suggested importance, something too valuable or too damning to simply throw away. And always his eyes returned to Ranger. The dog did not look away for even a moment. His entire being was tethered to that spot, bound by instinct and purpose. The dig deepened until the sound of metal rang out, a hollow, unmistakable clang beneath the soil. Shovels froze midair. The officers stiffened. Karen leaned in with her flashlight, a glint of dull gray reflected back. Metal, buried deliberately. The team dug faster now, adrenaline pushing them forward. Dirt flew in frantic arcs until the outline of a rusted container emerged. Rectangular, heavy, its edges corroded but intact. It was no ordinary box. It was a military-grade storage trunk, the kind built to endure decades, sealed against water and decay. The air thickened with questions. Why was a military trunk hidden here? Who had placed it beneath the shed floor? And why had Ranger refused to leave until it was uncovered? The trunk was dragged into the open. Its hinges groaned under the weight of years. Mud clung to its sides, and faint markings were etched into the metal numbers, perhaps, but too corroded to make out. Reed's pulse quickened. He had seen containers like this before in training exercises and in cases where evidence tied to federal investigations surfaced. They did not belong in old sheds in forgotten corners of town. The officers gathered close. Ranger stood at the edge, growling softly, teeth bared, not at the officers, but at the trunk itself, as though he understood what it carried. Karen reached for the latch, but Reed stopped her. "Wait," he said quietly. His instincts screamed for caution. The trunk's exterior was corroded, but the lock mechanism looked newer, reinforced. Someone had taken care to reseal it long after the shed had begun to decay. This wasn't abandoned. It had been hidden, deliberately. They radioed for specialized equipment and backup. Within half an hour, bolt cutters and protective gear were brought in. The tension grew unbearable as the first cut was made. Sparks flew. The lock snapped. The officers stepped back. The air seemed to press inward. heavy with anticipation. Reed glanced at Ranger, whose body quivered with restraint. His growl deepened, then stopped suddenly, replaced by absolute silence. His eyes locked onto the trunk, unblinking. Karen took a breath, braced herself, and lifted the lid. The hinges screamed. The trunk opened slowly, reluctantly, as though it fought against revealing its contents. Inside lay layers of plastic wrap, tightly bound. The officers peeled them back with gloved hands, each tier of plastic sharp in the stillness. Beneath the wrapping were objects that made no sense at first. Stacks of photographs, documents sealed in waterproof sleeves, and several small packages wrapped in waxy cloth. The photos were old, black and white, faded at the edges. They showed people, faces stiff with fear, groups gathered in places none of the officers recognized. Some wore uniforms, some looked like civilians caught in moments of desperation. Karen flipped one over. On the back was a date, nearly 40 years old. The documents were no less unsettling. Papers with official stamps, signatures, coded strings of numbers and letters. Some looked like government files, others like personal letters. None belonged in a shed, buried in secrecy. And then there were the packages, small, rectangular, wrapped with care. When one was unwrapped, it revealed a bundle of old currency, stacks of bills long out of circulation. Another package contained what looked like military dog tags, dozens of them clinking softly as they were lifted. The weight of it all settled heavily. This was no stash of forgotten belongings. It was a collection of secrets. Ranger barked suddenly, breaking the officer's trance. He lunged forward, pawing at the trunk again as if urging them deeper. His nose pressed against the bottom seam of the container, whining softly. Reed leaned in, feeling along the base. His hand struck something solid, another compartment, a false bottom. The officers carefully pried it open, revealing a second layer hidden beneath the first. What they found there made the air turn colder. Inside the hidden compartment lay a single item wrapped in cloth and sealed with wax. The cloth was stained, aged, but the seal intact. With careful hands, Reed broke it open. Inside was a journal. Its leather cover was cracked with age, its pages yellowed, but every word inside was sharp, ink preserved by time and care. The first page carried a name, written firmly as though the writer wanted to be remembered. The officers exchanged glances. None recognized it, but the weight of it was undeniable. Whoever had written this journal had wanted it hidden, yet preserved, buried, yet protected. The dig, the trunk, the journal, it all painted a picture that wasn't complete yet. The pieces were scattered, fragments of a puzzle whose image remained just out of reach. But the one unshakable truth was this: Ranger had found it. He had refused to move until the secrets beneath that shed were uncovered. Reed closed the journal carefully, his thoughts spiraling. Why would someone go to such lengths to bury a trunk of photographs, documents, and personal items? Why had it remained untouched for decades? And whose name was written in that journal? The questions pressed in from every side, but one thing felt certain. This discovery was bigger than their small town. It carried weight, history, and perhaps even danger. And as Ranger sat once more at the edge of the shed, eyes still fixed on the trunk, the officers knew they had only begun to unravel what had been hidden. Yet amid the tension, one glimmer of hope broke through. Whatever story the journal held, whatever truth those photos revealed, it had been pulled into the light, no longer buried, no longer forgotten. For now, the shed stood silent, its secrets unearthed, its shadows broken by beams of light, and the persistence of a dog who refused to let them pass unnoticed. And though the mystery deepened with each discovery, one thing was certain. The answers were close, closer than anyone could have imagined. But they were not ready yet. The journal waited. The past waited. And the final piece of the puzzle, the one that would leave everyone speechless, was still to come. The officers gathered in a circle around the trunk, their flashlights forming a halo of white across the ground. The journal sat in Reed's hands, heavier than it should have been, as if the leather binding carried more than ink. It carried years of silence. Ranger sat beside him, chest rising and falling in rhythm with his handler's breath. The canine's eyes stayed fixed on the journal, unblinking. It was as if Ranger understood this was what he had been guarding all along. Reed opened the cover. The pages crackled softly, the scent of aged paper mixing with the damp night air. His gloved fingers brushed the first entry, written in firm, deliberate strokes. October 3, 1982. If this journal is found, it means the truth has survived. My name is Captain Walter Hayes. I do not know who will read this, but I pray they will understand why I did what I did. The words drew the officers closer. Karen leaned in, flashlight steady, her face pale. The entries unfolded like a confession. Hayes had once been stationed at a nearby military outpost during the Cold War years. His unit had been involved in covert operations, training exercises that blurred lines, missions whispered but never recorded. But there was something more. The photographs in the trunk, the faces frozen in fear, were tied to those missions. Hayes had stumbled upon truths his superiors had wanted buried. Innocent lives caught in the crossfire of operations that were never meant to exist on paper. They told us to erase it, one entry read. They told us it never happened. But I cannot forget their faces. I cannot forget the children. Reed's throat tightened as he flipped through the pages. The journal detailed names, locations, dates, each one aligning with the photographs and documents in the trunk. It was evidence meticulously preserved, hidden by a man who had chosen conscience over orders. The discovery explained the dog tags, too. Hayes had collected them from fallen soldiers whose deaths were never reported, whose names had been quietly erased. He had refused to let them vanish without a trace. Karen whispered, barely audible, he was protecting the truth. Reed nodded, but the question pressed deeper. Why bury it here, in a shed at the edge of town? The answer came in the later entries. Hayes had returned home after retiring, carrying the weight of secrets he could never speak aloud. He had no family left, no one he could trust, and so he had hidden the trunk beneath the shed he inherited from his father. If I speak, they will silence me. If I hide it, maybe one day someone will find it. Maybe one day the truth will breathe again. The journal's final entry was the hardest to read. The ink wavered, the handwriting weaker. If this is found, know that I did not betray my country. I tried to honor it. The truth belongs to those who come after me. Protect it. Give voice to the forgotten. Reed closed the journal slowly. Silence weighed heavy across the circle. The air shifted as the magnitude settled in. This was not just a forgotten trunk. It was history, buried and silenced, carried alone by a man who could not bear to let it die with him. And it was Ranger, the dog who refused to move, who had brought it back into the light. The officers exchanged looks, each one carrying the same realization. This was bigger than their department, bigger than their town. It was the kind of discovery that demanded care, respect, and responsibility. But amid the weight, there was a strange sense of peace. The mystery of the shed was no longer shadow and speculation. It was truth, raw and unvarnished. And it was no longer hidden. In the days that followed, the trunk was transferred into secure hands. Federal investigators arrived, stunned by the find, poring over documents and photographs that filled gaps in history long denied. For once, the truth could not be buried again. News never broke publicly in full detail. Too many layers of secrecy still hovered over those old operations, but the evidence was acknowledged, preserved, and cataloged. Families who had lived in silence began to receive answers. Dog tags were returned, names restored, lives remembered. Reed stood quietly through it all, Ranger at his side. He often thought of Hayes, the man who had chosen secrecy to preserve the truth. He thought of the decades of silence and the courage it took to leave behind a legacy of honesty rather than blind obedience. Most of all, he thought of Ranger, whose instincts had pierced through the decades, who had refused to move until the shed gave up its secrets. Weeks later, Reed returned to the shed one last time. The boards had been removed, the ground cleared. What had once been a place of secrecy now stood open, stripped of its shadows. Ranger padded beside him, tail wagging lightly now, no longer tense. The dog sniffed the ground where the trunk had been, then sat down with calm finality. His eyes met Reed's, steady and satisfied, as if to say, "It's done." Reed crouched, running a hand along Ranger's fur. Gratitude swelled in his chest. They had solved the puzzle together, not just for themselves, but for people who had waited decades for the truth. Reed crouched, running a hand along Ranger's fur. Gratitude swelled in his chest. They had solved the puzzle together, not just for themselves, but for people who had waited decades for the truth. For the first time since the night of discovery, Reed felt the heaviness lift. The shed no longer loomed as a place of dread. It had become a place of closure. The story ended not with despair, but with healing. Families received answers. The forgotten were remembered. And one man's journal, once buried beneath dirt and silence, became a bridge between past and present. As Reed and Ranger walked back toward their vehicle, the horizon lit with the first light of dawn. A new day rose quietly, carrying the promise of clarity after years of secrecy. And for everyone who had stood by that shed, waiting in suspense for what it held, the truth was no longer a question. It was revealed. It was understood. And at last, it was free. Stories like this show just how incredible these canine heroes really are. And trust me, the next one will leave you even more speechless. Don't miss it. Hit that subscribe button and like this video now, so you're here when the next mystery unfolds.